Learn this Stoic lesson before it's too late. Stoic Philosophy for Life Mastery. There is a moment, and you know exactly which one I'm talking about, when everything around you is functioning, and yet something inside you is not. The bills are paid, the routine is intact, the people who love you are still there, and still underneath all of it, there is this low, persistent hum of a life that feels slightly off, not broken, not catastrophic, just not yours. That feeling is not weakness. That feeling is not ingratitude. That feeling is a signal, one of the most important signals a human being can receive, and almost nobody taught you how to read it. 2,000 years ago, a man sat down to write. Not for posterity, not for scholars. He was writing because the weight of living, even at the highest level of worldly power imaginable, demanded that he find a way to stay sane, stay honest, and stay human. That man was Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, and what he wrote in those private pages would become one of the most enduring maps of the human mind ever produced. But here is what most people miss about Marcus Aurelius, about Epictetus, about Seneca, about Stoicism in its truest form. This philosophy was not born in comfort. It was not assembled by men who had solved all their problems and decided to share their wisdom from a position of peace. It was forged in crisis. It was tested in loss. It was sharpened by the exact kind of internal chaos that you are carrying right now. Stoicism does not ask you to stop feeling. It does not demand that you suppress the grief, the anger, the exhaustion, the doubt. What it offers is something far more demanding and far more liberating. A way to meet reality, all of it, including the parts that are not fair, not kind, and not what you planned, with a mind so clear and so grounded that no circumstance on earth can take your footing from you. What you are about to hear is not a list of tips. It is not a motivational script designed to give you a temporary lift before the weight returns. What this is a confrontation. A direct, honest, chapter-by-chapter dismantling of every invisible wall that has been standing between you and the life your character is actually capable of producing. There are 15 chapters ahead. Each one goes deeper than the last. Each one will ask something of you. Not your applause, not your agreement, but your honesty. Because the Stoics understood something that modern life works very hard to make you forget. That the examined life is not a luxury. It is the only life worth the name. If you are here because something brought you, restlessness, curiosity, the quiet suspicion that there is a version of you that has been waiting, then stay. Because what Marcus Aurelius understood, alone in the dark before another impossible day, is something you were always meant to know. The noise before the silence. You wake up and it starts immediately. Before your feet touch the floor, the mind is already moving, cycling through the unfinished, the unresolved, the uncertain. The message you haven't answered, the conversation that didn't go the way you needed it to, the decision you keep postponing because every option carries a different kind of risk. And underneath all of that movement, there is something quieter, something the noise is specifically designed to drown out. This is the inner life of almost every person alive right now. Not the life they post, not the life they perform at work or describe to their friends, or even admit to themselves before sleep finally takes them. The real one. The one running in the background at all times, processing, replaying, rehearsing, bracing. The Stoics called this the life lived in reaction, the existence of a person who has handed the steering of their inner world to everything outside themselves, and then wonders why the journey feels so disorienting. You arrive there gradually, the way water finds its way into the cracks of a foundation, slowly, invisibly, until one day the structure is compromised, and you cannot point to the exact moment it began. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, Book 2, that the difficult people he would encounter that day were not obstacles to his peace. They were simply part of the landscape. His peace was never in their hands to begin with. Read that again. Not as inspiration, as diagnosis. Because if your peace is currently sitting in someone else's hands, in their approval, their behavior, their choices, then you are not living your life. You are living a hostage situation dressed as a normal day. The noise is not the enemy. The noise is information. It is telling you with great precision and great urgency exactly where you have surrendered your sovereignty. Every spike of anxiety points to an attachment. Every wave of resentment points to an expectation that reality refused to honor. Every moment of that low, restless dissatisfaction points to a gap between who you are behaving as and who you know, at your core, you are capable of being. The question is not how to make the noise stop. That is the wrong question. And chasing its answer is what keeps people cycling through distractions, through new beginnings that feel identical to the old ones, through the exhausting performance of a person who has everything handled when inside the machinery is grinding. The right question, the Stoic question, is this: what is the noise trying to show you? Because silence, real silence, is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of clarity, and clarity does not come from the world becoming simpler. It comes from you becoming more honest with yourself, about yourself, regarding the specific places where your thinking has been running on an old, unexamined script. This is where the work begins. Not with a technique, not with a breathing exercise or a journaling prompt, with a single act of recognition, the willingness to stop, look directly at the internal state you have been managing instead of examining, and say, something here belongs to me. Something here is mine to understand. That recognition, small and quiet as it is the first move of the Stoic mind. And it is the move that changes everything that comes after it. The confession. Marcus Aurelius never meant to publish. Marcus Aurelius never intended for a single person to read what he wrote. Not one word of it. What history calls the Meditations was a private journal, written in Greek, not Latin, precisely because Greek was the language closest to the part of him that could not perform, and it was never given a title by its author. The title it carries today was assigned centuries after his death, by people who found it and understood immediately that they were holding something that was never meant to leave the room. Why does that matter to you? Because of what it means about the man behind the philosophy. When you read the Meditations knowing he wrote it only for himself, the entire texture of the words changes. These are not the confident declarations of a sage who has mastered his mind. These are the daily dispatches of a man at war, a war fought entirely inside his own chest, on every page, with every entry. He writes about the temptation of laziness, the pull toward anger, the difficulty of treating people with patience when they have given him every reason not to. He reminds himself of the same principles repeatedly, not because he has forgotten them, but because the pressure of living keeps pushing him away from them, and writing is the rope he throws himself to find his way back. In Book 5, Paragraph 1, he writes about the struggle of getting out of bed in the morning, the Emperor of Rome, the most powerful man in the known world, writing to himself in the dark about the simple and human difficulty of rising to meet the day. He does not romanticize it. He does not pretend it is easy. He argues himself into it, reminding himself that he was made for a purpose, that the comfort of the bed is not what he was placed on earth to serve. If that does not reach something in you, read it again. Because here is what the mythology of Stoicism gets catastrophically wrong. The popular image of the Stoic is a figure of cold composure, someone who has transcended the mess of human feeling, who moves through crisis without flinching, who is so thoroughly master of himself that nothing lands. That image is not Stoicism. That image is a costume. And it is a costume that has caused more damage than it has prevented, because it turns a living philosophy into an impossible standard. Impossible standards do not liberate people. They shame them into silence. Marcus Aurelius flinched. He doubted. He struggled with the same emperor on the outside, exhausted man on the inside, contradiction that would break most people entirely. Epictetus, who was born a slave, who had his leg broken by his master and reportedly smiled through it, did not smile because he felt no pain. He smiled because he had made a decision, forged through suffering about what pain was and was not permitted to take from him. Seneca, who wrote some of the most luminous words ever composed about the brevity of life, struggled openly with his own inconsistency, his own fear of death, his own gap between the wisdom he taught and the life he managed to live. These men were not monuments. They were people, specific, flawed, struggling people, who found in philosophy not a way to stop being human, but a way to be human with integrity. And that distinction is everything, because if Stoicism is only for people who have already conquered themselves, then it is useful to no one. But if Stoicism is the tool that people in the middle of the conquest reach for, imperfect, tired, still making mistakes but refusing to stop, then it belongs to everyone, including you, especially you, in whatever state you arrived here today. The journal Marcus Aurelius kept was his daily act of reconstruction. He would drift from his values, from his clarity, from the version of himself he was committed to becoming, and he would write himself back. Not once, not twice, constantly. The same themes return across 12 books because the work of character is not a project with a completion date. It is a practice with no finish line. What he left behind, accidentally, against his intentions, purely as a byproduct of his private discipline, is the most honest document of a mind at work on itself that the ancient world produced. And the reason it still speaks across 20 centuries is not because Marcus Aurelius was extraordinary. It is because he was, beneath the title and the power and the philosophy, recognizably, undeniably human. Just like you. Carrying more than you show. Trying harder than anyone knows. And searching, in whatever way brought you here, for the same thing he was searching for in those pages before dawn. A way back to yourself. The identity you inherited without permission. Tell me something. The voice inside your head that says you are not quite enough. Where did it come from? The instinct to shrink before you are rejected, to apologize before you are accused, to work twice as hard for half the recognition, because some part of you believes that is simply what you deserve. Where did that begin? Because it did not begin with you. It was already running before you had the language to question it. Seneca articulated it with a precision that still cuts. Most people are not living their own lives. They are living the accumulated expectations, fears, and definitions handed to them by parents, by culture, by the particular circumstances of their formation. And they have never once stopped to ask whether any of it actually fits. Think about what you were taught, implicitly and explicitly, about what kind of person you are. Not the lessons you remember being taught, the ones that arrived without announcement. The raised eyebrow when you expressed a certain ambition, the silence that followed a particular kind of failure, the praise that came specifically and only when you performed in ways that made others comfortable. Over time, those signals did not just inform your behavior. They built your self-concept. They told you who you were, what was realistic for you, what kind of dreams belonged to people like you, and what kind did not. And you believed them, not because you were naive, because you were a child, and children are neurologically designed to absorb the environment as truth. The brain of a young person is not equipped to hold the identity of the people forming them at arm's length and evaluate it critically. It takes it in. It builds on it. It eventually mistakes it for the self. Epictetus understood this with the authority of someone who had no choice but to understand it. Born into slavery, his entire external identity was assigned to him by force. And yet he arrived at a conclusion that remains one of the most radical propositions in the history of human thought, that the self which can be assigned, commanded, or taken by another person is not the self that matters. The self that matters, the prohairesis, the rational will, the seat of genuine identity, belongs to no master, no culture, no inherited script. It is yours by nature. It was yours before the conditioning began, and it is still yours now underneath everything that was layered over it. The question is whether you have ever gone looking for it. Most people have not. Not because they are incurious or cowardly, but because the inherited identity is comfortable in the way that a cage can be comfortable. It is familiar. It has walls. It tells you exactly where you end and the world begins. Stepping outside of it requires the willingness to be uncertain about who you are in order to discover who you actually are. Seneca observes that people spend enormous energy decorating the life they were handed, optimizing it, defending it, but almost no energy examining whether it was the life they would have chosen. And the reason that examination never happens is not laziness, it is fear. Specifically, the fear that if you look honestly at the identity you have been living, you will find that significant portions of it were never yours to begin with, and that realization will demand a response you are not sure you are ready to give. But here is what the Stoics knew that the fear does not want you to know. The discovery that your identity was partly inherited is not a loss. It is a liberation. What was given without your consent can be examined without guilt. The beliefs that arrived before you had the tools to evaluate them can now be held up to the light of a mind that is fully awake and capable of deciding what stays and what does not. You are not obligated to carry every piece of furniture that was placed in the house of your mind before you were old enough to choose the decor. Some of it serves you. Some of it fits the person you are genuinely becoming. And some of it, the self-doubt that arrived as caution, the smallness that arrived as humility, the silence that arrived as politeness, some of it has been taking up space in a room you could have been living in fully for years. The Stoic practice here is not reconstruction. It is excavation. Going down through the layers of the performed self until you reach something that does not shift, something that holds its shape regardless of who is watching, regardless of what is being demanded, regardless of what the inherited voice says about what is permitted for someone like you. That thing is there. It has always been there. And the only question worth asking now is the one that has been waiting, with extraordinary patience, for you to be ready to hear it. Who would you be if you had chosen yourself from the beginning? The dichotomy that changes everything. There is a single idea at the absolute center of Stoic philosophy, not a metaphor, not an inspiring abstraction, a precise surgical, almost brutally practical distinction that, if you genuinely understand it, not intellectually but in your bones, in the way you actually respond to the events of a real day, will alter the architecture of your inner life more completely than any other shift you could make. Epictetus called it the most fundamental teaching. Marcus Aurelius returned to it so many times across the Meditations that it functions less like a principle and more like a heartbeat. Here it is. Some things are within your control, and some things are not. That is it. That is the whole thing. And if you felt a flicker of disappointment reading that, if some part of you expected something more elaborate, more worthy of 2,000 years of reverence, then that flicker is exactly the reaction that proves how deeply you still need it. Because the problem is never that people have not heard this idea. The problem is the distance between hearing it and living it. You can nod along to the dichotomy of control in the morning and spend the entire rest of the day burning energy on outcomes you cannot determine, consuming yourself with the opinions of people whose minds you cannot enter, suffering over events that have already happened and cannot be changed. Epictetus opens the Enchiridion, his handbook, his most direct and unadorned teaching, with this distinction. He does not warm up to it. He begins there because he understood that everything else in the philosophical life depends on getting this one thing right. What is in your control? Your judgments, your intentions, your desires, your responses, the direction of your attention, the values you choose to act from. These things are yours completely. No circumstance can take them. No person can remove them. No amount of external chaos can enter that space without your permission. What is not in your control? Everything else. The behavior of other people, the outcome of your efforts, your reputation in the minds of people who have already decided what they think, the economy, the weather, the past, the specific form the future decides to take regardless of your plans. Now here is where it becomes uncomfortable. Most human suffering, not all but most, is generated not by the things in the second category actually happening, but by the refusal to accept that they belong there at all. The anxiety is not caused by uncertainty. It is caused by treating uncertainty as a problem you are obligated to solve, rather than a permanent condition of existence you are invited to make peace with. The resentment is not caused by what another person did. It is caused by the belief that their behavior was yours to control, that their choices were somehow a reflection of your worth. that the world owed you a different outcome and failed to deliver. This is the mechanism, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Marcus Aurelius writes in Book 6 about the concept of returning to your own lane. Not in those words, but in that precise spirit. He reminds himself in the middle of ruling an empire that his work is not to determine how things turn out. His work is to act from principle, with full effort, with complete integrity, and then to hold his attachment to the outcome loosely enough that when reality responds differently than he hoped, his footing does not disappear. Think about what that would mean in your life, not in the abstract, specifically. The project you poured yourself into that was not recognized the way you deserved. The outcome was never yours to control. Your effort, your integrity, your quality of attention, those were. The relationship that ended in a way that felt unjust. The other person's choices were never yours to determine. How you treated them, who you chose to be in that dynamic, those were yours. The opinion someone holds of you that is wrong, unfair, assembled from incomplete information, that opinion lives in a place you have no access to. What you do with your character while they hold it, that is entirely yours. The relief that comes from genuinely internalizing this is not the relief of giving up. The Stoics were not passive. Marcus ran an empire through wars, plagues, and political betrayals. Epictetus built a school and shaped generations of thinkers. Seneca produced a body of work that still breathes. These were men who poured everything into the process, the part that belongs to them, and released the outcome with a steadiness that came not from indifference, but from clarity. The relief is the relief of setting down a weight you were never supposed to be carrying, the weight of other people's choices, the weight of outcomes in an uncertain world, the weight of a reputation you have been managing instead of a character you have been building. When you draw the line with precision, here is what is mine, here is what is not, you do not become smaller. You become concentrated. All the energy that was bleeding out into the uncontrollable comes flooding back into the one place it was always supposed to live. You, your judgment, your response, your next deliberate, conscious, fully chosen move. That is the dichotomy that changes everything. Not because it is new, but because the day you stop merely knowing it and start actually living it is the day the noise begins. For the first time, to quiet. The art of wanting the right things. There is a particular kind of suffering that nobody talks about honestly, because it arrives dressed as success. You work towards something for months, sometimes years. You sacrifice for it, restructure your life around it, measure your worth against your progress toward it, and then you get it. There is a moment, brief, sometimes so brief it frightens you, of genuine satisfaction, followed almost immediately by the quiet, disorienting realization that you feel essentially the same as you did before. The thing you were certain would change the interior landscape of your life is now simply part of the landscape, already normalizing, already failing to deliver the fundamental shift you were counting on. And then the mind does something extraordinarily efficient and entirely automatic. It finds the next thing, the next level, the next acquisition, achievement, or arrival point that this time will surely be the one that finally does it. And the cycle continues, not because you are broken, not because you are ungrateful, but because you have been operating on a map of desire drawn by a culture with a significant interest in keeping you perpetually unsatisfied. Epictetus called this the fundamental error of desire, directing appetite toward things in the external world that are impermanent, unpredictable, and incapable of filling the space inside a human being that only a certain kind of inner development can reach. Marcus Aurelius writes in Book 9 about the way people pursue wealth, power, and reputation as though these were genuine goods, when in fact they are what he calls indifference, things that may or may not accompany a good life, but which have no power to produce one. Seneca observes that men give the best years of their existence to the accumulation of things they will spend their final years realizing they did not need, having sacrificed in the process the one currency that cannot be replaced, time given to the actual work of becoming who they were capable of being. This is not an argument for poverty. It is not a case against ambition. What the Stoics were pointing at was something far more subtle. The difference between pursuing things because they genuinely serve your values, your growth, and your contribution, and pursuing them because you have confused their acquisition with the resolution of an inner incompleteness that no external thing has ever in the history of human experience resolved. The distinction sounds simple. In practice, it requires a level of self-honesty that most people actively avoid. Because to sit with the question, why do I actually want this, is to risk discovering an answer that disrupts the narrative you have built your forward motion around. What if the career you have been climbing toward is not really about the work, but about finally earning a form of approval that was withheld early in your life? What if the recognition you are working toward is not really about impact, but about silencing a voice from your past that told you that you would never be significant? None of these motivations make you a bad person. They make you a human one. But building your life's direction on top of them without examining them is like constructing a house on a foundation you have never inspected. The structure may stand for years before the unexamined cracks in the base become impossible to ignore. Marcus Aurelius had a practice that speaks directly to this. He called it the view from above, a deliberate act of mental perspective in which he would imagine himself pulled back from the immediate desire, the immediate anxiety, the immediate craving for a particular outcome, until he could see it from a distance that returned it to its actual size, not to diminish it, but to ask, from that expanded vantage point, whether the thing he was moving toward was genuinely aligned with the values he had chosen to live by. The Stoics had a word for the things genuinely worth wanting: virtues. Not in the sanitized moralistic sense that the word has accumulated over centuries of religious usage. In its original meaning, from the Latin virtus, from the Greek aret, virtue meant excellence of character, the full development of what a human being is specifically capable of being, courage in the face of genuine difficulty, justice in dealings with others, especially when injustice would be easier, wisdom in the navigation of complexity, temperance, not deprivation, but the self-possession that comes from knowing you are not at the mercy of every appetite that announces itself. These were, for the Stoics, the only genuine goods. Not because material things are worthless, but because material things are conditional. They can be lost, taken, destroyed, or simply fail to satisfy, while character, once genuinely developed, belongs to you in a way that nothing external ever can. Every morning, before the day begins constructing its demands around you, you have the opportunity to ask a question that most people never ask. What am I actually moving toward today? And is it worth the life I am spending to get there? Not every answer will be clarifying. Not every insight will be comfortable. But the asking itself, the simple, repeated, courageous act of turning toward your own motivations with genuine curiosity, is already the beginning of the only kind of freedom the Stoics believed was real. Not the freedom of having more, the freedom of needing less of the wrong things, so that the space can be filled finally, fully, and permanently by the only thing that was ever going to satisfy it, the ongoing, demanding, irreplaceable work of becoming who you actually are. Memento Mori, the meditation that makes you alive. The practice is this: remember that you will die, Memento Mori, Latin for remember death. And before the discomfort of that phrase causes you to move past it quickly, which is precisely what the mind trained by a death-denying culture will attempt to do, stay here for a moment. Because the Stoics were not dwelling in death. They were using the awareness of death as a lens that makes life legible in a way that nothing else can. Seneca opens his essay on the shortness of life with a provocation that remains, 2,000 years later, one of the most unsettling sentences in philosophical literature. He writes that life is not short. It is that we waste so much of it. The time we are given is sufficient for everything that genuinely matters if we are actually present to it. The problem is not the length of life. The problem is the thickness of the fog through which most people live it. The fog of distraction, of deferred meaning, of the assumption that there will always be more time later for the things that matter now. Think about the last time you were genuinely awake to your life, not performing it, not managing it, not moving through it on autopilot while your mind rehearsed conversations that have not happened yet or replayed ones that cannot be changed. Actually present to it, to the specific texture of a specific moment, aware that this exact configuration of reality will never occur again, and that you were, in that instant, alive in a way that most people in most moments are not. Those moments tend to arrive unbidden. A diagnosis that reframes everything. A loss that strips away the decorative and leaves only the essential. A near miss that reorganizes your priorities in the space of a single breath. We receive them through pain, and for a brief window afterward we live differently, more deliberately, more gratefully, more attuned to what we actually value. And then, slowly, the fog returns. The urgency fades. The horizon of death retreats to its comfortable theoretical distance, and we resume the postponement. The Stoic insight is that you do not have to wait for the crisis. You can choose to look directly at the horizon at any time, and the practice of doing so, regularly, honestly, without flinching, produces not anxiety but its opposite. It produces clarity. It produces the kind of presence that does not require an emergency to arrive. Marcus Aurelius writes in Book 4, "Think of yourself as dead. You have lived your life. Now take what is left and live it properly." He is not counseling despair. He is counseling liberation, the specific liberation that comes from understanding, at the level of genuine feeling rather than abstract knowledge, that what you have is now. Not a rehearsal, not a draft, not the practice run before the real thing begins. This, today, the person across from you, the work in front of you, the moment you are in, which is departing even as you inhabit it. There is a companion practice the Stoics called negative visualization, the deliberate imagining of loss before it occurs, not to generate dread, but to generate appreciation. Epictetus taught his students to hold the people they love with what he described as a loose grip, not because love should be withheld, but because the person who loves with the awareness that this person, this moment, this version of this relationship is temporary, will love more fully and more attentively than the person who treats it as permanent and therefore takes it for granted. To look at someone you love and allow yourself to genuinely feel, even for a moment, what their absence would mean, and then to return from that imagining to their presence, is to discover that the conversation you were about to have carelessly is worth having carefully. This is what Memento Mori actually does when it is practiced, rather than merely intellectualized. It does not make you sad. It makes you selective. It makes you impatient, not with people, but with the things that consume your hours without serving your values. It makes you less tolerant of the postponement of what matters and less invested in the accumulation of what does not. Seneca writes to Lucilius, "Omnia aliena sunt, tempus tantum nostrum est." Everything else belongs to others. Time alone is ours. And the tragedy he is pointing at is not that life is brief, it is that people surrender willingly, without noticing the one thing that cannot be returned. The hours given to resentment, the years spent building a life that belongs to someone else's expectations, the decades of waiting for the moment to arrive when it will finally feel safe to begin living as though the life is actually yours. The moment never arrives on its own. It has to be chosen, and the choosing of it requires exactly the confrontation that Memento Mori demands. The honest, uncomfortable, ultimately freeing acknowledgement that the time between now and the end is finite, that it is moving regardless of whether you are paying attention to it, and that the only question worth organizing your life around is this: what are you doing with what you have been given while you still have it? The obstacle is the way. There is a letter Seneca wrote to Lucilius late in his life, after he had survived exile, political persecution, and the increasingly erratic cruelty of an emperor who would eventually order his death. He writes that he would not have wished for a life without obstacles, not because he enjoyed suffering, but because he had come to understand, through decades of living rather than merely thinking, that the obstacles were not interruptions to his development. They were the mechanism of it. This is the idea that Ryan Holiday, drawing directly from Marcus Aurelius, captured in a phrase that has since become one of the most recognized distillations of Stoic philosophy in contemporary culture. The obstacle is the way. But the phrase risks becoming decorative. something you nod at in a difficult moment without allowing it to do the structural work it was designed to do. So it is worth going back to the source. Back to what Marcus actually meant, and why he kept returning to this idea with the consistency of someone who needed it not as inspiration, but as medicine. Marcus Aurelius writes in Book 5, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." He is describing something he observed not just philosophically but practically, in the course of running an empire that seemed to generate an unrelenting supply of things going wrong. Wars that were not supposed to happen, plagues that killed indiscriminately, betrayals from people he had trusted, a body that was failing him slowly throughout his reign. And yet the Meditations, written in the middle of all of it, does not read like the journal of a man being ground down. It reads like the journal of a man who had found a principle strong enough to metabolize almost anything. The principle works like this: when an obstacle arrives, and it will arrive, and it will not ask for your permission or your readiness, you have a choice that most people do not realize they are making. You can relate to it as an interruption, something inserted between you and where you were going, something to be endured until it passes. Or you can relate to it as information, as material, as the specific form that your next development has decided to take. The second response is not natural. It is trained, and the training requires a willingness to look directly at the thing you would most prefer to avoid, and ask not when will this be over, but what is this asking of me? Epictetus argued that every difficulty you encounter is, at its core, an invitation to exercise a capacity that cannot be developed any other way. Patience cannot be built in the absence of things that require patience. Courage cannot be developed without situations that activate fear. The capacity to maintain clarity under pressure cannot be cultivated in the absence of pressure. The very conditions that feel like they are working against you are the only conditions under which the self you are capable of becoming can be forged. This is not a call to seek suffering. It is a call to stop treating the suffering that arrives uninvited as pure waste. The question of whether a difficult experience destroys you or develops you is not determined by the experience itself. It is determined entirely by the orientation you bring to it. The same loss that breaks one person open into greater depth and compassion can leave another person closed and bitter for decades, not because the loss was different, but because the relationship to it was. There is a specific application of this that deserves to be named directly. It is not the large obstacles, the catastrophic losses, the dramatic failures, the crises that arrive with enough force to demand a response. Those paradoxically are often easier to metabolize through this framework, because their magnitude makes it impossible to ignore them. The harder application is to the small, daily, persistent frictions, the colleague whose behavior consistently undermines your work, the creative project that will not come together in the way you need it to, the relationship that requires more patience than you feel you have, the gap between who you are today and who you know you are capable of being. These smaller obstacles are the real training ground. Because they arrive constantly, they do not announce themselves as opportunities, and the temptation to simply be annoyed by them is overwhelming. And yet it is precisely in these ordinary resistances that the Stoic practice either takes root in the actual texture of a life, or remains a beautiful idea that lives only in books. The question Marcus kept asking himself was simple: not why is this happening to me, but what can I do with this? Not who is responsible for this obstacle, but who do I get to be in the presence of it? The self that emerges from genuine struggle, from the decision to meet resistance with intention rather than reaction, from the practice of finding the forward path through every impediment rather than around it. That self is not the self you were before the obstacle arrived. It is a self the obstacle made possible, and it would not exist without it. Amor Fati. The love of what is. There is a response to difficulty that goes beyond acceptance, beyond tolerance, beyond the stoic gritting of teeth that people sometimes mistake for the actual teaching. Nietzsche called it Amor Fati, the love of fate, not the endurance of what happens, not philosophical resignation, the active, genuine, cultivated love of everything that occurs, including, and especially, the things you would never have chosen. Marcus Aurelius expressed the same idea in different language. In Book 10 he writes, "Love only what happens to you and is woven into your fate, for what could be more fitting?" He is describing the end point of a practice, the place the Stoic arrives after years of working with the dichotomy of control, the reframing of obstacles, the confrontation with mortality, the examination of desire. The practitioner reaches a point where the resistance to what is begins to dissolve, not because reality has become easier, but because the war against it has become clearly and permanently unwinnable. There are two ways to stop fighting what is. The first is defeat, the exhausted, resentful surrender of someone who tried to control the uncontrollable for long enough that they simply ran out of energy. This is not Amor, Fati. It is a form of suffering that has simply changed its posture. The person who has surrendered in this way is not at peace with their life. They are at war with it in a way that has gone quiet, but has not gone away. The second way is transformation. The arrival, through genuine practice, at a place where you no longer experience what happens to you as something that requires your resistance in order to be survived. Where you have developed enough trust in the process, in your own capacity to respond, in the fundamental workability of reality as it actually is, that events which would once have destabilized you become, not welcome exactly, but genuinely integrated, held not with clenched hands but with open ones. The practical movement toward Amor Fati begins with a shift in language that is small enough to seem trivial and large enough over time to restructure the entire relationship you have with your experience. It begins with replacing the phrase, "This should not be happening," with the question, "What is this asking of me?" Because the moment you ask that, you have already made a subtle but seismic move. You have shifted from a posture of resistance, in which reality is the problem, to a posture of engagement, in which you are an active participant in what happens next. From there, the practice deepens. You begin to notice, slowly, then with increasing frequency, that the things you most resisted have a consistent pattern of delivering something that was not available any other way. The relationship that ended with enough pain to redefine your understanding of loss also, eventually, clarified what you actually needed. The professional failure that felt like the closing of a door turned out to be the pressure that redirected you toward the work you were actually supposed to be doing. The illness, the loss, the period of genuine darkness, with a regularity that becomes over time impossible to dismiss. These were the things that made you. What the Stoics asked, with increasing insistence as the philosophy deepens, is that you loosen the grip. Hold your preferences lightly enough that when reality declines to honor them, which it will with regularity and without apology, you do not collapse around the gap between what you wanted and what arrived. Instead, you look at what arrived, honestly, without the distortion of what you wished it were. And then you ask the only question that has ever produced anything useful in the face of the uninvited. What can I make of this? And then, and this is the move that separates the philosophy from the performance, you make something of it. Not eventually. Not once you have finished grieving or adjusting. Now. With what you have. In the life that is actually yours, not the one you were planning. That is Amor Fati. Not the love of suffering. The love of reality. The refusal to spend the one life you have been given, wishing it were a different one. The inner citadel. Building a self that cannot be taken. Marcus Aurelius returned to one metaphor with enough regularity that it is clearly not rhetorical decoration, but a load-bearing concept. He calls it the inner citadel, the fortress of the self, the place inside a human being that, if properly constructed and maintained, cannot be breached by anything the external world sends against it. The philosopher Pierre Hadot, who spent decades studying the Meditations more carefully than almost anyone in the 20th century, identified this as the central project of Marcus's entire philosophical practice. Not the management of circumstance, not the optimization of outcome, the construction of an interior that was genuinely sovereign, not because it was walled off from experience, but because it had developed the capacity to receive any experience without being defined by it. to be moved without being swept away, to feel the full weight of difficulty without being crushed by it, to remain, through everything, recognizably and reliably oneself. This is a different project than most people are engaged in. Most people are working on the outside, building the resume, the reputation, the financial architecture, the physical presentation. There is nothing wrong with this work. What the Stoics noticed was that all of this external construction rests on ground that can shift without warning. Reputation can be destroyed in an afternoon. Financial security can dissolve in a crisis. The relationships you build your stability around will, one by one, end, through distance, through change, through the irreversible fact of mortality. This is an argument for investing serious energy in the one structure that does not depend on external conditions for its integrity. The self. Not the performed self. Not the self assembled from other people's expectations. The actual self. The one that exists in the space between stimulus and response, in the quality of attention brought to a difficult moment, in the values that hold their shape when everything around them is under pressure. Epictetus spoke of the self as an inner fire, something that, properly tended, will provide light and warmth regardless of the weather outside. You cannot control the weather. You can tend the fire. And the person who has learned to tend it brings the conditions with them. You have almost certainly encountered someone like this, a person whose stability in the face of difficulty seems to come from somewhere other than the absence of difficulty, who remains curious where others become defensive, who remains generous where others become withholding, who does not require the validation of the room to know where they stand. The quality you are sensing in that person is not luck, and it is not personality. It is the result of interior work, accumulated in private, in the choices made in ordinary moments, in the practice of return. Marcus writes in Book 4, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." This is not a claim about emotional imperviousness. It is about the difference between having a feeling and being had by it, between noticing that anger has arrived and being consumed by it without remainder. The construction of the inner citadel does not happen through a single dramatic decision. It happens through repetition, through the small, consistent choices that accumulate over time into a character, into a way of being in the world that becomes increasingly stable, not because the world has become less challenging, but because the self meeting it has become more fully itself. Marcus wrote the meditations to himself as reminders, as corrections, as the necessary repetition of truths that he knew in theory and was still working to embody in practice. The fact that he needed to keep writing them is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of honesty. It is what genuine philosophical practice looks like from the inside. The inner citadel is not a destination. It is a direction. A commitment to the daily, imperfect, absolutely necessary work of building a self that can inhabit its own life, fully, freely, and without requiring the world's permission to do so. The building begins not at some future point when circumstances are more favorable. It begins in the exact conditions you are in right now, in the response you choose in the next difficult moment, in the quality of attention you bring to the next conversation, in the small, private, unwitnessed decision to return to yourself one more time, in the middle of everything that is trying to pull you away. That is where the citadel is built. One choice at a time. Starting now. Living. According to nature. The philosophy of enough. Live according to nature. This phrase appears at the foundation of Stoic philosophy with such regularity that it functions almost as a password, and it is almost universally misunderstood. The Stoics did not mean a return to material simplicity. They did not mean living outdoors or rejecting the conveniences of civilization. They meant something far more precise and far more demanding, living in alignment with what you actually are. And what distinguishes human nature in the Stoic account is reason, the capacity for reflection, the ability to step back from impulse and ask not merely what do I want, but what is actually good, not merely what is available, but what is enough. Seneca writes to Lucilius, "It is not the man who has too little who is poor, but the man who hankers after more." The culture in which most people operate does not run on enough. It runs on more. More is the engine of the economy, the premise of advertising, the implicit promise of almost every system of aspiration that surrounds you from childhood. And the machinery of more is extraordinarily effective at one specific thing, ensuring that the experience of enough is perpetually deferred. That the arrival point, the place where you will finally feel settled, satisfied, genuinely at rest, is always just beyond where you currently are. The Stoics diagnosed this not as a moral failure, but as a cognitive one, a failure of perception. The person who cannot find enough in what they have is not deficient in willpower. They are operating with a miscalibrated instrument, a faculty of desire that has been trained to mistake stimulation for satisfaction and accumulation for fulfillment. And because the instrument is miscalibrated, no amount of acquisition will fix it. You cannot solve a problem of perception with more of the thing the perception is distorting. The recalibration the Stoics proposed is not deprivation. The Stoic is not someone who has decided to want less in some ascetic performance of virtue. The Stoic is someone who has learned to see clearly enough that the wanting itself has changed, not through suppression, but through genuine understanding of what actually produces the life they are after. Marcus Aurelius lived in a palace, and yet the meditations are full of sharp reminders to himself not to be seduced by any of it. Not because luxury was sinful, but because he had noticed with the precision of someone paying honest attention that the pleasure of acquisition was always brief and the hunger it left behind was always slightly larger than the hunger it had temporarily satisfied. He had watched this pattern operate in himself and in the people around him with enough consistency to understand it as a feature of the mechanism, not a problem with the specific objects of desire, but with the structure of wanting itself when it operates without the governance of reason. The philosophy of enough is therefore not about the quantity of what you have. It is about the quality of your relationship with what you have, developing the capacity to be genuinely present to your actual life, not the life you are planning, not the life you will have once the next acquisition is complete. This life, with these resources, in these relationships, doing this work. There is a practical test worth sitting with honestly. Think about the things you are currently pursuing that you believe will make your life feel like enough when they arrive. Now ask, what is the evidence from your own history that arrival produces the feeling you are anticipating? How many previous arrival points actually delivered the settled satisfaction you expected? And how long did it last before the instrument recalibrated upward and the next thing became the new threshold of enough? Enough is not a number. It is not a circumstance. It is a practice. It is the daily, renewable choice to be actually present to the life you are living, rather than perpetually absent in the life you are waiting for. And it is available right now, in exactly the life you currently have, if you are willing to look at it clearly enough to see it. The art of voluntary discomfort, training for resilience. There is a practice described in Seneca's letters that strikes most modern readers, on first encounter, as somewhere between eccentric and masochistic. He describes deliberately setting aside periods of time during which he lives as though he has lost everything. He eats the food of the poor, he wears rough clothing. He sleeps without the comforts his wealth and position would ordinarily provide, not as punishment, not as performance. Because he had identified something most people discover only when crisis forces the discovery upon them, that the fear of losing what you have is, in most cases, significantly worse than the actual experience of not having it. And the only reliable way to neutralize that fear is to walk toward it voluntarily before life presents you with the uncontrolled version. The philosophical basis for the practice lies in what the Stoics understood about the relationship between desire and fear. Every strong attachment to a comfort, a convenience, a person, a status, a way of life generates as its shadow a corresponding anxiety. You cannot have one without the other. The more tightly you hold something, the more of your available attention is consumed by the implicit monitoring of its continued presence. This is not neurosis. It is the natural operation of a mind that has been allowed to organize itself around things that are not up to it. The solution the Stoics proposed is elegant in its logic and demanding in its application. Instead of waiting for the loss to arrive, which it will eventually for everything, you practice the loss in advance. You introduce, deliberately and on your own terms, the discomfort that your fear is trying to protect you from. And in doing so, you accomplish two things simultaneously. You discover, empirically rather than theoretically, that the experience is survivable, often more than survivable, sometimes clarifying in ways that comfort never is. And you loosen, gradually but genuinely, the grip that the attachment has on your capacity to function freely. Epictetus was precise about what the practice actually develops, not toughness in the crude sense, not the suppression of feeling or the performance of indifference, what he called the strength of the prohairesis, the faculty of choice, the part of the human being that decides how to respond to what arrives. Every time you voluntarily choose discomfort over comfort when comfort is available, you strengthen that faculty. You build, through repeated exercise, the muscle that will be called upon when the discomfort is no longer voluntary. The modern application of this principle scales across every domain of a life. It is the conversation you have been avoiding because it will be uncomfortable, practiced in smaller, uncomfortable conversations, until the avoidance reflex weakens. It is the creative work you have been protecting yourself from by not starting, approached through deliberate engagement with the discomfort of beginning until the beginning loses its power to stop you. It is the physical challenge at the outer edge of what you believe yourself capable of, engaged with regularly enough that the boundary of capability moves. It is the fast that reminds your body, and more importantly, your mind, that hunger is not an emergency. The pattern in all of these is identical. You choose deliberately and in advance to spend time in the condition you are afraid of. You discover that you are more capable within it than your fear was reporting. And over time, the fear, deprived of its primary source of power, which is your avoidance of the thing it is warning you about, begins to occupy less of the architecture of your life. Seneca, after his periods of deliberate simplicity, reports not relief at returning to comfort but something more interesting, a shift in his relationship to comfort itself. The practice had not made him indifferent to pleasure. It had freed him from the dependency on it that had, without his full awareness, been subtly organizing his choices. He could enjoy his life without needing it to be comfortable in order to be bearable. This is the return on the investment of voluntary discomfort, not the elimination of pleasure, the liberation of it. The difference between enjoying what you have because you have genuinely learned to appreciate it and consuming what you have because your anxiety about its absence has made the consumption compulsive. One is a life, the other is a habit dressed up as one. On grief and loss, the Stoic heart. There is a letter Seneca wrote after the death of a mutual friend that still reads, 2,000 years later, like something written this morning by someone who genuinely understood what grief is. He does not open with philosophy. He opens with acknowledgement. I know that you are grieving. And he lets that stand before saying anything else. The popular caricature of Stoicism, someone who has elevated themselves above the reach of loss through the application of sufficient reason, is not Stoicism. It inverts the actual teaching. The Stoics grieved. Marcus Aurelius lost children, and the traces of that grief are present in the Meditations in ways no philosophical framing fully contains. Epictetus lost students he loved. Seneca lost friends and ultimately his own life under circumstances that would have justified any measure of bitterness. These were not people who had designed feeling out of themselves. They had developed a relationship with feeling characterized by honesty about what it was, and wisdom about what to do with it. The Stoic account of grief begins with a distinction between the experience of loss, the actual, felt, embodied reality of absence, and the narrative the mind constructs around that experience. The grief itself is real, human, and in the Stoic view, evidence of a life fully lived. The narrative, this should not have happened, this absence is a permanent wound that defines everything that follows, is where the philosophy intervenes. Not to eliminate the feeling, to examine the story being wrapped around it. Seneca distinguishes between grieving and what he calls the performance of grief. the prolonged suffering that has become less about the person lost and more about the identity of the person doing the suffering. Grief that has become a way of not moving forward because moving forward feels like a betrayal, or simply a habit, something the nervous system has organized itself around because the alternative requires a reorganization that feels unbearable. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Loss is nothing else but change, and change is nature's delight." Read in context, surrounded by the full weight of what he was carrying, it reads like a man who has sat with enormous loss and is working, in real time, to find a frame large enough to hold it without being destroyed. Not denying the loss, but refusing to let it become evidence that the universe is fundamentally hostile, or that the ground of life is untrustworthy. Epictetus told his students, "When you kiss your child goodnight, say to yourself, 'I am kissing a mortal.' Not to diminish the love, to practice the full presence that genuine love requires, love that knows what it has while it has it, that when the loss arrives, and it will arrive, there is grief, but not the prolonged agony of the love that was always saving itself for later, and now discovers that later is gone. The antidote to the devastation of loss is not less attachment. It is more presence. Not loving less so that losing hurts less, but loving with full knowledge of impermanence so that the love itself is complete. The Stoic heart is not a closed one. It is not armored or sealed against the risk of feeling. It feels everything. It is destroyed by nothing. And it keeps moving, not because the loss was small, but because the life is still here, still asking something. The answer is presence. Again and again and again. Amor Fati, the love of fate. Amor Fati, the love of fate. Not the acceptance of fate. Not the tolerance of fate. Not the grudging acknowledgement that what has happened cannot be undone, and must therefore be minimally incorporated into the ongoing project of living. The genuine, active, practiced orientation toward everything that arrives, including the things that arrive as loss, as difficulty, as the precise opposite of what was wanted, as something not merely to be endured but embraced, as the raw material of the only life that is actually available. What makes this concept difficult is the implication that seems to follow, that suffering is good, that loss is fine, that the things that devastate us should, if we were philosophically sophisticated enough, be welcomed with open arms. If this were what it meant, the skepticism would be entirely warranted. But this is not what it means, and the distinction is precise enough to be worth tracing carefully. Marcus Aurelius does not write that the death of his children was good. He does not perform gratitude for the losses that cost him something real. What he does is refuse to add to the loss the additional suffering of wishing the world were organized differently than it is. He distinguishes between the thing that has happened and his relationship to the thing that has happened. Amor Fati is the commitment to exercising that jurisdiction, not in the direction of reluctant acceptance, but in the direction of something more active, more genuinely engaged with the reality of what is present. Epictetus frames this with characteristic directness. Do not seek for things to happen as you wish, but wish for things to happen as they do, and you will have a tranquil flow of life. He is not saying, want nothing. He is saying, the suffering that is added to difficulty by the resistance to difficulty, by the insistence that it should not be happening. This suffering is optional. It is not the difficulty itself. It is the friction generated by the collision between the difficulty and the demand that it not exist. And that friction, unlike the difficulty itself, is entirely within your power to reduce. Amor Fati is the practice of reducing it, not by diminishing the difficulty, not by pretending the loss is not a loss, but by changing the orientation from which you meet what arrives. From resistance, which adds suffering to difficulty without reducing the difficulty, to engagement which asks not why is this happening but what does this make possible. Not what have I lost but what is present now, in the wake of this loss, that was not visible before. This is not a natural movement. It runs against the grain of the mind's default response to unwanted experience, which is the immediate and forceful generation of reasons why the experience is wrong and should not be. The mind is extraordinarily good at this. It can produce, in seconds, a comprehensive case for the injustice of almost any difficulty. A case that is often partially correct, often genuinely compelling, and almost entirely useless in terms of what it actually produces in the life of the person making it. Nietzsche put the aspiration most starkly. My formula for greatness in a human being is Amor Fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely to bear what is necessary, but to love it. This is not a description of where most people are. It is the direction of travel, the horizon that orients the journey, even if the journey never arrives at the horizon itself. The Stoics understood something about fate that is easy to miss, that the relationship between what happens and what you make of it is not fixed. Two people can lose the same thing, and one can spend the rest of their life defined by the loss, while the other finds in the wake of the loss a depth and a clarity and a capacity for presence that the comfort preceding it had made unnecessary and unavailable. The difference is not luck. It is not personality. It is the practiced, imperfect, renewable choice to meet what arrives with something closer to love than resistance. To say, not easily, not without grief, yes, this too. This is my life, and I am going to live it. That is Amor Fati, not the pretense that everything is fine, the commitment to being fully alive in everything that is. The Stoic in relationships, love without losing yourself. There is a tension at the heart of Stoic philosophy that becomes most visible, most pressurized, most difficult to hold in a stable way when the philosophy meets the domain of human relationships. The Stoics teach that the only reliable foundation for a good life is the cultivation of your own inner resources, your reason, your judgment, your independence from the external world's capacity to determine your experience. And yet human beings are, irreducibly and fundamentally, relational creatures. We are formed in relationship, sustained by relationship, capable of our deepest experiences of meaning only in the context of genuine connection with others. And genuine connection involves exactly the kind of vulnerability and exposure to loss that the Stoic framework seems at first reading designed to protect against. The first simplified resolution, the cold Stoic, defended and emotionally unavailable, who invokes Stoic independence as justification for emotional withholding, is not Stoicism. The second, abandoning the philosophical framework entirely the moment genuine feeling arrives, is equally false. The Stoics themselves navigated something more difficult and more interesting than either of these. Marcus Aurelius wrote with genuine tenderness about his wife Faustina. Seneca's letters to Lucilius are saturated with the particular quality of attention that characterizes someone who genuinely loves the person they are writing to. Epictetus encouraged his students to form genuine attachments, to love their families and friends with full awareness of the risk that love entails. The Stoic teaching on relationships is not a teaching about loving less. It is a teaching about loving differently, with a quality of presence and freedom that the love organized around need and control does not produce. The distinction begins with the difference between love and anxious attachment. The love that is genuinely free can achieve a quality of presence the anxious attachment cannot, because the anxious attachment is always at some level monitoring, watching for signs of change, of withdrawal, of the threat that the thing it is organized around might be removed. This monitoring consumes exactly the attention that presence requires. You cannot be fully with someone while simultaneously running the background process of ensuring that they continue to behave in ways your emotional stability depends on. Epictetus. Never say about anything that I have lost it, only that I have given it back. The person you love is not your possession. They are on loan, from time, from the ordinary impermanence that governs everything that exists. The recognition of this does not diminish love. It clarifies it. It removes the element of ownership that is one of the primary sources of suffering in most relationships, for both the person doing the owning and the person being owned. This is what it means to love without losing yourself, not to maintain a careful emotional distance, but to bring your full self into the relationship, your values, your judgment, your genuine capacity for engagement, while recognizing that the other person's choices, feelings, and direction of travel are ultimately in their own jurisdiction, that your love for them is not conditional on their continued conformity to the role you need them to play. The Stoic in relationship is someone who has done enough internal work to love from a position of genuine fullness rather than from need, who brings to the relationship not the hunger of someone who requires the other person to complete them, but the generosity of someone who has enough, and therefore loves not out of dependency, but out of genuine choice. This is the only kind of love that is actually capable of seeing the other person as they actually are, rather than as the projection of what the loving person requires them to be. Marcus Aurelius wrote about his obligations to the people around him in terms that make clear he understood relationship as a fundamental dimension of the good life. Human beings are made for each other, he writes, either educate or endure. Underneath the compressed austerity of the phrase is something recognizably warm, an acceptance of the difficulty of other people, that is not resignation but genuine engagement. The goal is not the elimination of vulnerability. It is the development of a self strong enough to be genuinely vulnerable, to be fully in the relationship, fully present, fully affected, without being destroyed by the ordinary losses and difficulties that genuine relationship always, eventually, produces. That is the Stoic heart in relationship. Not closed, not defended. Open, and stable enough in itself that the opening does not require the other person to be anything other than exactly what they are. Stoicism and work, craft, purpose, and the present task. There is a passage in the Meditations where Marcus Aurelius writes about the importance of doing your work. Not grand work. Not the work of empire or legacy. The work in front of you today, in this hour, with the materials and circumstances actually present rather than the ideal conditions that are not. He writes about the craftsman who takes pride in their craft, not because it will be remembered but because the doing of it well is its own complete justification. He writes about the obligation to apply yourself fully to the task at hand, as though it were the only task, as though the quality of your attention to this specific thing were the single most important expression of what you value. The modern framework for work is organized almost entirely around outcomes. The work is justified by what it produces: the money, the status, the recognition, the career advancement, the eventual arrival at some future state in which the work will have been worth it. The present moment of working is understood primarily as instrumental, as a means to an end that exists somewhere ahead of it. The quality of the work matters, but it matters because of what it produces rather than for what it is. The Stoic inversion of this is clean and complete. The work is not justified by its outcomes. The work is justified by the quality of the attention and intention brought to it, by whether it is done in accordance with virtue, with full engagement, with the kind of care that reflects genuine respect for the task and the people it serves. The outcomes are preferred indifference, things you might reasonably hope for, things you can work toward, but not within your jurisdiction in the way that the quality of your present engagement is. The first consequence of this is the relationship to recognition. One of the most reliable sources of suffering in professional life is the gap between the quality of work done and the recognition it receives. Work done well that goes unnoticed. Effort that produces no visible result. In the modern framework, where the outcome is the justification, this gap represents genuine failure. In the Stoic framework, the work done well was complete in the doing of it. The person who has genuinely internalized this is not indifferent to recognition. They may still prefer it, but they are not dependent on it for their sense of whether the work was worth doing. And this independence produces over time a quality of professional stability that the outcome-dependent worker cannot maintain. The second consequence is the relationship to the present moment of working itself. If the work's value lies ahead of itself, then the present moment of doing it is structurally something to be gotten through rather than genuinely inhabited. The mind is always partially elsewhere, at the imagined destination, and the work suffers for it. The person who is fully present to the task in their hands, not thinking about what the finished piece will earn or how the work will reflect on their reputation, but attending fully to the logic of the argument or the grain of the problem, is doing better work than the one whose attention is divided between the present and the imagined future. The Stoic ethics and the practical reality are, in this case, in complete alignment. Seneca was suspicious of busyness. He noticed that people who are constantly busy, who fill every available hour with activity, who describe themselves as overwhelmed with work as though the overwhelm were a badge of seriousness, are often, on closer examination, avoiding something. Avoiding the quality of attention that genuine work requires, using the appearance of productivity as a substitute for the reality of it. The Stoic worker is not busy in this sense. They are engaged, not the performance of effort, but the genuine investment of attention in the task that is actually present. Marcus Aurelius, governing an empire while writing some of the most enduring philosophy in the Western tradition, while conducting military campaigns, while managing the complications of court and the constant demands of people who needed things from him, wrote about his work in terms that never suggest overwhelm at its scale. He writes about each task as though it were the only task. He sees in the complexity and demands and frustrating limitations of his actual circumstances, not ideal circumstances, but these ones, the precise material with which a human life can be made excellent. Meaning is not a property of the work. It is a property of the relationship between the worker and the work. It is generated by the quality of engagement, by the genuine care brought to the doing of it, by the alignment between the work and the values of the person doing it, not by the scale or the recognition or the social status of the work itself. The invitation the Stoic philosophy extends is not to find the perfect work. It is to be the kind of person who does their work, whatever it is, wherever they are, with whatever materials the day has actually provided, fully, carefully, and well. The rest is outcome, and outcome, as always, is not up to you.